DJ is actually, he's brilliant. He won't let you know that himself generally, but he's just a joy to work with. DJ's an infection preventionist. He recently got, this last year, his VABC. We want to applaud that. We love it when our IPs join our group and get their board certification in vascular access. So he has his master's in public health. He is board certified in infection prevention and also vascular access. So he's been involved in infection prevention and infectious disease for 8 years. He has experience in research, state and public health, academics, and in acute hospitals. He also has some experience with the CDC. His background is in human biology and epidemiology, and his focus is at the intersection of antimicrobial resistance, vascular access, and infection prevention. He likes to do lots of stuff in his free time. I didn't know you played the saxophone, so that I would add some more things to this, but I'm going to leave it to yours this time. He likes board games, hiking, rock climbing, making pottery, and without further ado, I'll bring on DJ Shannon, who will do our presentation today. DJ, welcome.
Thanks, Judy. Thanks for the intro and not embarrassing me this time.
This time.
All right, sounds great. Thank you all so much for having me here. We're going to talk about blood culture contamination. I will say that this is it's designed to be a short talk and just very brief. So this is really not getting into a lot of the deep nitty gritty. This is just very much so let's introduce the topic and talk about this as a concept because it's very pertinent today. It has been, but it is becoming more and more pertinent, especially with hospital and site bacteremia coming on the rise. So I have no conflicts of interest. Today, we will review the scope of our problem that we're talking about. We'll discuss some of the implications of blood culture contamination, and then we'll also just do a high-level identification of the opportunities that we have to be able to help decrease those blood culture contamination events. All right, so let's dive in here. I get really excited. I'm a big nerd. And as Judy said, I have a background in antibiotic resistance. And so whenever I get to kind of nerd out in that space, it gets me really excited. I've found few other areas that get me as excited. And I've learned recently, not so recent, but vascular access and blood culture contamination is a big passion area of mine over the last couple of years. And for me specifically, blood culture contamination is kind of this weird, cool conundrum in the middle of all of my interests. So it impacts diagnostic stewardship and infection prevention and vascular access and device stewardship and the development of antibiotic resistance. And so it really kind of swirls around all of these areas that I'm really excited to work in. So as a whole, blood culture contamination is kind of this sort of pickle, if you will, because it impacts all of these areas on the screen. So it's the lab, it's our pharmacists, it's our nursing staff, it's infection prevention, it's patient experience, it's vascular access and phlebotomy. So who owns this problem? Usually if we're talking, let's say CAUTI, okay, well, infection prevention is probably going to be at the top of that list, collaborating with our nursing colleagues. But for blood culture contamination, we have 5 or 6 different disciplines that we have to consider as to who's gonna take ownership of this. Obviously, the lab is reporting out our contamination rates, but then beyond that, what happens? And so unless we've got a facility that's really, really tackling this initiative, you might not necessarily have all those dots connected. And that's another reason why I think it's really cool, because it really brings a lot of disciplines to the table to work on patient safety. So just as again, high level information here, thinking about where blood culture contamination might occur. It could come from poor collection technique, maybe improper skin preparation. It could also be we selected maybe a less than ideal site. So we know that doing peripheral sticks is associated with lower contamination risk than drawing straight from an IV catheter. And it could even be the broth medium that the laboratory chooses to use. There's all sorts of different growth plates that promote the growth of this pathogen or that pathogen, et cetera. So that could also cause just some issues with blood culture contamination. There's several different areas, and I'm sure more than the four that I just simplified it to, that we could be looking at. So when we think about this issue, we have to, of course, measure it. Everything in our world in healthcare comes back down to counting things and seeing what we can do to impact those counts. So if we look at our contamination rate, there's two different measures. The first one that we'll talk about right now is contamination rate. And that is what I imagine most people are familiar with seeing. That's sort of the standard. That is going to be the number of contaminated blood cultures divided by our total blood cultures that we have probably in a month. So if you look to the literature, there are several studies out there that have looked at their blood culture contamination rates, and you see something around 0.6% all the way up to 12.5% for contaminated blood cultures. I'm sure, as most people know, we currently have a 3% goal for our monthly blood culture contamination. There's been a lot of discussion about it. There's, especially through the American Hospital Association, that's been really kind of driving this with the CDC and other partners to really take a closer look at this 3% goal. And we'll touch on that here in a couple of moments, but there's a lot of talk about this 3% goal being moved to a 1% goal. Our other potential measurement that we could use to look at this problem space is, and now I made this term up because I couldn't find like what people actually refer to this this measurement. So I called it the contaminated positivity percent. So this is just looking at, of all of our positive blood cultures, what's our percent of those that are contaminated? So it's just another way to look at the problem. And in the literature, for our positive blood cultures, we're seeing something about 13 to 56% of those positive blood cultures are actually contaminated. So that's significantly higher than we'd like to see. We have to apply this concept to be able to utilize this measurement more fully. We would start with a simple formula where then we're going to do some calculus. And I'm totally kidding. This is literally nothing. I just copied and pasted. And since I can't see any of you, I'm going to assume that this landed and it was a very good joke and you're all laughing.
I am laughing. I am.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Honestly, those are quite literally just copy and pasted out of Excel predetermined formulas. I have no idea what any of that crazy nonsense is. I don't like to be normal, and I like to be weird and throw in some jokes. So hope it was fun. To actually enumerate this blood culture contamination problem and thinking about it, if you go to the literature, you're going to see something in the 20 million, 30 million, 40 million annual blood cultures. I even saw as high as 50 million. I went with a bit more of a conservative effort or estimate from, I think it was a 2021 article that said 30 million annual blood cultures here in the United States. And if we use that 3% blood culture contamination goal, that has us at 900,000 contaminated blood cultures every year. And that is right there why that 3% is sort of being heavily scrutinized, because that is a lot of contaminated blood cultures that we are doing a lot of additional work for that's not necessary, and it's impacting our patients. In general, when we think about the contaminated blood cultures, we're typically seeing those normal skin flora. So our coag staph, the Corynebacterium, Bacillus, Micrococcus, Cutibacterium, the kind of the standard skin pathogens or bacteria that we would expect to see. Okay, so we've done a high level, talked about our problem space, sort of understood, if we're even meeting that 3% goal, which I will tell you in my experience, it's not typically met. Hopefully you all are. That 900,000 blood cultures per year is quite the problem space. Just from the lab side alone, the amount of blood culture contamination that is occurring has such an impact for them, because that means they have to do more work. For all of our positive blood cultures, that might mean additional blood cultures. That might mean CBCs or BMPs, or potentially having to run, if we started a patient on vancomycin, they might have to be doing troughs. And so there's all sorts of things that the lab might come into play here and impact their workload. which means that they're going to have more work to do. So then they can't get to those critically necessary labs as quickly. So then their turnaround time might even be slower. And then, of course, we're spending more man time doing this. We're spending more equipment and like specimen collection as well as the machines. So all of this is going to mean that the lab costs are increasing as well. For the clinical impact for the patient, the patient who had that positive blood culture contamination might actually be exposed to more antibiotics, which could drive antibiotic resistance. They might need additional IV access, especially if they're on IV antibiotic therapy. And we might even see an increased length of stay in those patients. So for our antibiotics, the literature shows that for individuals that had a contaminated blood culture event, there was a 39% increase in antibiotic charges compared to those individuals who were culture negative. We know that the more IV access our patients have, that's putting our patients at greater harm risk for things like infiltration, extravasation, phlebitis, infection, etc. You guys know this, of course. And the literature shows for our increased length of stay, on average, if an inpatient individual has a blood culture contamination event, they're seeing about 5.4 extra hospital days compared to culture negative patients. And then when you take that and look at increasing our harm risk, we have a study that went and kind of calculated or put some numbers to that increased risk for each additional night in the hospital or each hospital day. So for our HAIs, every day that they're in the hospital, their risk of developing an HAI is increased by 1.6%. And then for our medication errors or developing a decubitus ulcer, their risk increases by 0.5% every day. And then, of course, there's other harm risks as well that we would have to be concerned with. When we look at quality, sepsis comes to mind for me as we're dealing with blood cultures potentially impacting our pneumonia surveillance, how this might impact our CLABSI surveillance, especially if we end up having these kind of like false positive CLABSIs, if you will. So we might have to call a CLABSI on a patient who actually had a blood culture contamination event. There are some ways that NHSN surveillance definitions sort of help account for contamination, but there are certainly situations where it could fall through the gaps. And then with hospital onset bacteremia coming to us in the near future, hopefully, we have been informed that blood culture contamination is likely to be an associated measure with hospital onset bacteremia surveillance. So we definitely know that it is, out there as a factor for our quality indicators. And then when we look over to the cost and the dollar sign of this, looking back at the literature, there were several studies over the last couple of decades that looked at the cost of blood culture contamination, and every single one showed an increase. I went ahead and just pulled the most recent study from the United States, which was published in 2019, and that saw a $6,463 price tag with every single contamination event. And they associated most of those costs, with 79%, from having prolonged hospital stays and increased antibiotic therapy as our top contributing factors for why the contamination event costs so much money. So then if we bring back that 900,000 contaminated blood cultures per year, again, if we're meeting our current 3% goal, and add a $6,463 per contaminated event, that is $5,816 or 816,000. No, I can't math at all. $5,816,700,000 per year. Whew. And if someone checks my math, I might be wrong because I can't even say it clearly. So that right there is a lot of money from sort of red herrings, if you will, that things that, like, if we really worked on decreasing this, we could be saving a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of potential harm for our patients. Okay, so moving on to our opportunities to help decrease some of the costs of our blood culture contamination events. There was a recent study that showed the use of sterile kits actually helped decrease annual costs by $483,000. the use of phlebotomists, or I will say, because I know especially in some facilities, our vascular access teams work as phlebotomists or they're integrated on the same team. And then there was also a proxy for if we had trained and competent staff collecting blood cultures versus just, sort of everybody is doing it rather than proven competent staff are doing blood draws. So the use of, I will say, competent individuals, we saw a decrease of about $289,000 per year. And then this is, relatively new device on the market. There's a couple out there that are initial specimen diversion devices. And we saw in the literature about a $272 decrease per culture. So just a couple of opportunities there to help decrease that rather large dollar sign. So to round us off here, if we think about the solutions in general that we can use to help decrease this problem space. So diagnostic stewardship is a great place to start, making sure that we are appropriately identifying those individuals who really truly do need blood cultures and not selecting individuals that may not need the real blood culture. And then also trying to avoid the, just 24-hour blood culture repeat sort of orders. So making sure we're really being good stewards with our lab resources, ensuring that we're doing a good job with skin prep before we collect the blood cultures, making sure that we're wiping off the caps of our blood culture bottles with the 70% alcohol. The collection site selection, again, we talked about this a little bit earlier, just having at the forefront of our mind that if we do a peripheral stick versus drawing straight from a device, we're going to see differences in our contamination rate. And so opting for a straight blood draw. And then moving on to hand hygiene. Of course, every infection preventionist is going to have to harp on hand hygiene. The study also, this was from one of the literature pieces, saw that potentially using sterile gloves might help impact contaminated events as well. The use of standardization kits. So similar to what we do with like central line dressing kits, to be able to have a stepwise do this, do first, do this second, do this third, have all the things that we need for this specific procedure in a single kit. So that way we can sort of standardize and make it systematic and as easy as possible to set ourselves up for success. Ensuring that when we do collect blood cultures, we're collecting appropriate volumes. So if we have too little or too much, then we might increase the risk of a contaminated blood culture. And those volumes do differ based on adults, peds, and neonates. Again, having phlebotomy teams, having our vascular access teams be involved, having just generally competent individuals collecting our blood cultures. Making sure that we're providing feedback based on our surveillance. So I imagine every lab is tracking their blood culture contamination and is likely sending that to someone in the facility. But if we're not getting that feedback back to the individuals who are actually collecting those blood cultures, then we have a missed opportunity in our quality improvement or our process improvement. So making sure that feedback is really getting where we want it to go to those frontline staff who are collecting our blood cultures. And then again, using this idea of a diversion device has also been shown to help decrease our contaminated events. So all of these together are various solutions that we can do or utilize to help reduce our blood culture contamination. Hopefully, many of these are things that we are already doing. Maybe it's a need for some additional education or competency and return demonstration. Maybe it's additional surveillance points, working on the decreased unnecessary blood cultures, et cetera. So just working on trying to pull all these pieces together to help be that solution to decrease our blood culture contamination. Here's a list of my references. And with that, I will stop rambling at you guys. So maybe we can have a little bit for Q&A.
DJ, thank you. That was great.